no one in their right mind would make the mistake of calling the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition government that ruled from 2010 to 2015 a libertarian administration. Nevertheless, I think that we need to accept actually what a good job they have done on the economic front. Now, public spending was a huge part of the election campaign. It was a central part of the coalition agreement and the program of government over the last 5 years. And now when you adjust for inflation and for population growth, the coalition actually reduced spending by about 9% in total over the course of their government, which is pretty good going. I think it's especially good going when you consider that they protected healthcare spending in real terms. That is the single biggest item of expenditure of the British government, when they also promised to increase old age pensions according to what they call the triple lock, which was pensions every year would rise by 2.5%, inflation or wage growth, whichever happened to be higher. Pensions are the other biggest ticket item in British public expenditure. So taking those two out, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats did actually quite a remarkable job, especially in the midst of a recession following a financial crisis, of reducing the size of government in the UK. Now, by way of comparison, under Margaret Thatcher's administration, and of course, Margaret Thatcher is seen as one of the most transformative free market leaders in recent times, public spending went up by 18% in real terms. Now, if you look forward over the next 5 years, the Conservative government is promising to cut spending by a further 8% real per capita. Well, that's over the next 4 years. Then very conveniently, they're going to increase spending by 2% in time for the next general election. But hey, nobody's perfect. Overall, over the course of a decade, should this plan be followed, we're looking at the size of the state being reduced from 45% of GDP down to around 35% of GDP. We're really going from convergence with the rest of the European Union towards convergence with the United States in terms of size of government. Now, clearly that is not as far as many of us in this room would like to go, but it's certainly a start. It's worth pointing out as well briefly that taxes have been cut. The personal allowance, the amount on which you don't pay any income tax at all, has been raised very significantly and will continue to do so. Corporation tax cut from 28 to 20%. The top rate of income tax reduced from 50% to 45%, and the new government has promised to pass a law banning any increases in income tax, national insurance, or value-added tax, our three biggest sources of tax revenue, over the course of the next parliament. So that's to 2020. Good news then, I would say, on fiscal policy. Turning to welfare reform, I think, again, the coalition government did a pretty fantastic job. Their policy really consisted of two things. One, making sure that work always paid, that you were always better off taking a job than staying on benefits. Secondly, putting private providers in charge of welfare provision and incentivizing them through payment by results to get people back into work and to keep them there. Now, this consisted of an overall cap on the amount of benefits that a household could receive. It consisted of fairly strict work and job-seeking requirements on those receiving public assistance. It involved the creation of a new universal credit, which worked kind of like, or well, it's beginning to work kind of like Milton Friedman's old negative income tax idea, in that it's withdrawn at a steady rate so that every pound you earn, you see some benefit of, whereas in the past, people faced these huge marginal tax rates where they'd actually be much worse off if they earned any additional money. The result of this, or the result partly of this, of course, there are other factors involved as well, but Britain now has the highest employment rate it has had in recorded history at some 73% of the population. And over the course of the last government, the UK created more net jobs than the rest of the European Union combined. So that's more than another 27 countries. This, I think it's fair to say, would all have gone by the wayside had a Labour government been elected. With a Conservative majority, I think it's going to be continued and probably deepened, and with some luck, can be embedded over the course of the next 5 years so that it's much harder to reverse in future. The final point I want to make on economic freedom, although this is really more a question of social policy now that I look at it, is the Conservative or the coalition government's education reforms, their school reforms. What they did was to essentially introduce a fully fledged school choice system and to couple that with policies to hugely increase the supply of good school places. They've let a lot of existing schools in the state sector become so-called academies, which gives them a great deal more independence to tailor the tuition they offer to the needs of the students they have before them. They've also encouraged the establishment of free schools, similar, I think, to charter schools in the United States. These are privately run, privately established schools that operate within the state system, as in they're funded with taxpayer pounds, but they are nevertheless free from most of the requirements that are normally imposed in the public sector. Some 400 of these free schools have been established. There are plans for 500 more. 70% of the ones that have been set up so far have been rated good or outstanding, and I think crucially, the research shows that they are 8 times more likely to open these free schools in the most disadvantaged areas compared with the least disadvantaged areas. Predictably enough, it seems to be the case so far that where free schools are set up, it's not just that those free schools offer a better education, but that because of the force of competition, the other schools in the same area start to raise their game and offer a better education as well. Now, it sort of surprises me, actually, having moved to the United States in 2012, to be standing here today offering such glowing praise of the coalition government, because I look back at some of the things I wrote about them before my departure from the UK. Perhaps I was just in a miserable mood at the time, but it wasn't all that nice. And I kind of look at that now and I wonder why. When, as I've just explained, I think the Conservatives have done a fantastic job with their Liberal Democrat coalition partners on public spending, on education, on welfare, 3 of the most important issues they faced. I think the issue basically is that the Conservatives, or the coalition's rhetoric, but particularly the Conservatives' rhetoric, was really anathema to most of what libertarians believe in. We want to see people standing up, talking about freedom and liberty and markets, and you basically never get any of that from the Conservatives. On the other hand, the reality of the policies that they've pursued have been far more impressive than their rhetoric would suggest, and thinking back now, I suppose I ought to have been looking more at the substance and less at the style. Now, I've said that the coalition government did a good job on economics, and I think that the Conservatives will continue to do a good job on economics. Nevertheless, I think there are things that libertarians have good cause to be rather worried about. Now, and it's worth saying at the outset, I suppose if we were talking about a Republican government being elected in the United States, we might be worried about some sort of social conservative policies. This, I think, is not a danger with the Conservative Party. Their election manifesto actually said, our historic introduction of gay marriage has helped drive forward equality, and so on and so forth. I think it'll be probably a cold day in hell when you see that in a Republican platform. So social issues are not a problem. Civil liberties, on the other hand, I think are a big issue. Mark has already alluded to this, and I won't repeat that wonderfully juicy quote he offered from David Cameron, essentially suggesting that a free society, according to the rule of law, was something we ought not bother with anymore. But the government has already said they're going to seek to bring back the Snoopers Charter. That's not what they call it, but that's what everyone else calls it. The Snoopers Charter basically consists of internet service providers and telephone companies having to collect every electronic communication anyone in Britain makes and store it for a year. They'll be paid with taxpayers' money to do so, and they will have to make that information available to the police, to the intelligence and security services, to the National Crime Agency, and of course to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It's hard to imagine what could go wrong there. In the last few days, we've also heard proposals for a new anti-extremism bill in the UK, which basically offers an extraordinarily broad definition of extremism. I know I would probably count under some parts of this. I suspect many people here would. The government defines extremism, this is a quote from the government, as the vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and the mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. We also regard calls for death of members of our armed forces as extremist. Well, now, clearly, you can see why a lot of extremism would fall into that category. You can also see, I think, why with such a broad definition, a lot of activity which isn't terribly extreme would fall under it as well. Certainly, if opposition to the rule of law is a problem, David Cameron should be put on the database himself. If it's individual liberty, there are certainly a good couple of hundred members of Parliament who should be added to the register. And, well, there's lots of people who aren't so sure about democracy after the results of the most recent election as well. So what happens if you're defined as an extremist under these extremely broad terms? Well, in that case, the police can apply to the High Court to limit any harmful activities you may undertake. A harmful activity is anything that risks public disorder, harassment, alarm or distress, or is a threat to the functioning of democracy. Should you meet this very low bar, your organization could be banned, your premises could be closed, you could be banned from talking in public, you could be banned from broadcasting, you could be banned from protesting, you could even be forced to run all of your tweets and Facebook posts past the Metropolitan Police before you publish them, which is rather Orwellian, I think. Now, it's fair to say that the British government is facing a genuine problem with extremism, but it's also clear that giving the government such broad powers is extremely unwise. We already know this. In 2005, an 82-year-old gentleman was detained at the Labour Party conference under anti-terrorism laws for heckling the Foreign Secretary. In 2008, it was discovered that 50% of local governments in Britain were using counter-terrorism surveillance laws to spy on people who were not sorting their recycling properly, or failing to clean up after their dogs, or most wonderfully of all, selling unapproved pizza. The police have been accessing journalists' phone records to identify whistleblowers. That's happened on a couple of occasions recently, both involving senior politicians. And another disturbing instance, I think, was the treatment of Glenn Greenwald's partner, David Miranda, when he passed through an airport in the UK. He was detained for 7 hours under anti-terrorist legislation. For 6 of those, he was interrogated quite aggressively without a lawyer present. All of his electronic equipment was confiscated. And we've seen similar things happen at The Guardian newspaper. Britain's hate speech rules, again, are designed to counter extremism, terrorism, and so on. In fact, they've seen people investigated for calling fat people lazy. They've seen people arrested for making inappropriate jokes about Glaswegians, and they've seen people sent to jail for sending racist tweets. I think the lesson here is that there's a good reason why government should be limited, and that's that we're not ruled by angels who can be trusted to use every power we give them justly and fairly and with the kind of reserve which we might think appropriate. That's why I'm rather scared by the powers that the British government is trying to develop for itself in the area of civil liberties. I fear I've gone a little bit long, so I'll go very quickly onto the Scottish question. Mark laid out the political problem very clearly. The policy problem is that Scotland has what the comedian Billy Connolly called a wee pretendy parliament. I wouldn't be quite so insulting, of course, but he spoke to a real problem, which is that the Scottish Parliament, although it's responsible for 60% of the public spending that happens in Scotland, doesn't currently raise a penny of that itself. It is purely an elected spending body that gets a grant from Westminster and then determines how it will spend it, how it will allocate it. If you imagine a political system with that kind of structure, it's pretty clear why your incentive is always towards spending more, never towards spending less, why people really have no interest in voting for a more free market government. Of course, they can't see the upside in terms of lower taxes or more efficiency and so on. And this is a big part of the reason why Scotland, I think, since devolution in the late 1990s, has continued to drift to the left, just as the rest of Britain, eventually realizing how it had opened the public spending spigots through the 2000s, has tacked back towards fiscal conservatism. This has set up a huge tension within the United Kingdom, such that one wonders if it will remain united very much longer. The simple answer is fiscal autonomy for Scotland. The less simple answer is outright independence. I must admit I have no particular problem with Scotland becoming independent, but they ought to know it will be a rocky road to get there. A rocky road which will require them to significantly cut public spending, probably radically reduce their taxes to invite inward investment, significant public service reform to deal with a population which is aging more rapidly than the rest of the UK, and possibly, if they're fully independent, a monetary system which allows them very little flexibility on spending and prevents them, in all likelihood, from being able to bail out their banking systems, offer deposit insurance, and so on and so forth. Now, you may think that the vision there I just sketched out is rather a good one from the libertarian perspective, and I would agree with you. Nevertheless, it is not what anyone in Scotland who's voting for independence expects or wants, and it's extremely unlikely, I fear, to come to pass. So to sum up extremely briefly, the state of freedom in the UK looks very good on economics. It looks rather problematic on civil liberties, and there is a big question as to whether the kingdom will remain united very much longer. Thank you all.